Hello, everyone. Welcome to Danger on Delmarva. My name is Rhonda Jefferson, and I'll be your host as we explore the sometimes dark and treacherous paths that lead around Delmarva. Even though today we will be looking more at the pathways in the sky, as we'll be covering an aviation incident. I first heard about this incident when I was watching something from the Air Safety Institute. Though, in terms of aviation, you don't really think of Delaware when you think about any type of commercial aviation. We do have Dover Air Force Base, but it's not a commercial center. So any of the normal aircraft incidents that you may hear about in Delaware usually have to do with what's called general aviation, which is not the practice of having, say, a large Boeing or Airbus, like a commercial airport. We have the smaller airports that kind of dot the communities in the area. Also, in a lot of the cases that I cover here, it's very difficult to find information about the victim or victims in the case or the event. But in this particular incident, we actually have probably more information about the pilot of the plane than we do of the actual incident itself. So this will allow us to get more of a backstory and understanding of some of the thoughts and actions that the pilot may have taken. The pilot in this crash is actually a very well-known and well-renowned surgeon in the medical field. And while exploring this case, I actually came across another crash of another pilot who was also a doctor. And though I normally don't cover the huge well-known cases on the on either this podcast or my other one, Mystifyingly Missing. So I actually did an episode on Mystifyingly Missing about the other pilot as well, who you may recognize the last name, Richard Rockefeller. And yes, of those Rockefellers. And that particular accident did have some parallels to this one, as well as another more famous aviation incident. So I will link the other podcast in the description of this episode. I will be recording that one directly after I'm done with this. So depending on how quickly you listen to this one, it may or may not be up by the time you're done with this particular episode. I also found that there were a number of aviation incidents that did involve doctors, mostly as the pilots, but I did find some heartbreaking cases too. One where, doctors, they were the ones killed or injured by the crash, but they were even just in their own backyard. So I will be looking at those for future episodes, mostly though for the Mystifyingly Missing podcast. And I'm abbreviating it Mystifyingly Missing because the whole title is Mystifyingly Missing True Crime and Thought-Provoking Events, because it covers quite a few different types of cases, kind of like the same cases that we cover here. Just a few things before we start into the episode. While I'm recording this, we are getting very close to 3,000 downloads, and so that's kind of exciting. I just wanted to mention that. Also, I don't necessarily like doing this, but I do have a PayPal link in the description, and that's because sometimes either looking at different resources or as I use newspapers.com, that's a subscription service. We do have to pay occasionally for those types of resources. I'll continue, of course, doing the podcast no matter what. It's just I have access to more sources with some of the cases by having to pay for those resources. In covering this episode, as usual, there will be discussions of events that some people may find troubling or triggering. In this particular case, it has to do with the death of an individual. So I just wanted to let everybody know that. And with that being said, let's begin today's episode. When covering different types of accidents, there's usually more than one factor that leads to the accident itself. It may be a mistake made in calculations, a misjudgment about the weather, mechanical factors, and not to mention just the human factor. And while, yes, today I'm talking about it in aviation, really whenever there's any major accident where there's oversight, a lot of oversight as far as the individual and the machinery being used, then it's usually more than just one thing. So even when looking at things such as structural failures, it's usually something to do with either calculations, miscommunication, combination of things that lead to the actual tragedy. And so in the case of more commercial aviation, there's so many redundancies built into an aircraft that if something goes wrong, if a system happens to fail, there's usually a backup or something that can be done to help mitigate that. Plus, there's also a second pilot who's monitoring information and is there to pick up any mistakes, hopefully, if the other pilot does make any. When looking at today's case, there is one pilot in a small general aviation aircraft. And general aviation is really just aviation where it's not related to commercial flight. You'll usually hear that in terms of the smaller planes such as Pipers or Cessnas that people fly. So when there's just one individual checking his own or her own work, basically, that increases some of the risk itself. You don't have that second set of eyes or the second set of ears to run something by or to discuss things. So just from my perspective, as someone who does not have a pilot's license, looking into general aviation, when there's a single pilot, that concerns me the most. Also, I did hear a while back that one of the major aircraft manufacturers was looking at having a single person cockpit for commercial flights. But I personally am completely against that because you never know when there may be a medical emergency or if someone just does need that second set of ears and eyes to help them with difficult situations. Today's incident involved just a single pilot in a Cessna, and that was a Cessna Aero, so we're not talking about a large aircraft at all. The person flying the plane that day was Dr. Clifford Turen. He was a man who had impacted so many people, both on Delmarva, in the communities that he had worked throughout his career, as well as internationally, as he was an internationally renowned surgeon. He was flying to Delaware so that he could perform surgery on the following day. So let's hear a little bit about the life of Dr. Turen before this incident occurred. So a lot of the information that I found comes from his obituary, as well as other news articles and pretty much memorial pages or articles written about him. There was more information, like I said earlier, in articles that I found than we would normally know about most pilots or air crash victims. Dr. Turen accomplished a lot in his relatively short life. He was 55 years old at the time of this incident, and that's actually a year younger than my husband, so it puts some things in perspective for me. He accomplished more than what many people could expect to accomplish in 2 to 3 lifetimes. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, and graduated high school in 1975 from the Wheatley School in East Williston, New York. He later went on to Johns Hopkins University and graduated from there in 1979. Johns Hopkins is in Maryland. It's on the western side of Maryland, so over the Bay Bridge in Baltimore. And I've been there a few times for doctor's appointments, so it's a couple hours away from where I live. So he probably did have a general idea of the area prior to even starting to work in Delaware. He did eventually stay in the Baltimore area for a while, so we'll look at that in just a few moments. He got his medical degree from the State University of New York, otherwise known as SUNY, Upstate Medical University. If you hear the term SUNY or State University of New York, those are colleges throughout New York State that do offer, undergraduate education, and sometimes they do actually focus towards one career path. So this was one of the universities that he attended. He did complete his residency at the Long Island Jewish Medical Center, and that's in New Hyde Park, New York. He was, as I said, flying towards Delaware or to Delaware to perform surgery on the following morning. He was at this time a trauma surgeon at Bay Health Medical Center in Dover. His specialty was orthopedics. If you're from Delaware or may have visited Delaware recently, you may be familiar with Bay Health. At the time of this incident, they were more in Kent County, which is the middle county of Delaware, but they are starting to expand some towards Sussex County, having a hospital in each county. And that's pretty important because in a lot of the locations, especially in Sussex County, it can sometimes be quite a distance before you can get to a hospital that really caters to your needs. Just to give an example, I have a family member who's going through some health issues, and we've been taking him back and forth to doctor's appointments, but we're actually having to go to Maryland for most of his visits, and his surgery will also be in Maryland. So to have a medical, I guess you would say, institution where it's more than just one location is important to a lot of areas in especially southern Delaware. It can also be difficult at times to keep doctors at certain hospitals because the hospitals individually may not necessarily have access to all of the resources that larger hospitals do. So working with an institution that has multiple locations can sometimes help keep doctors in the area because they have access to more resources, as well as the possibility of patients being able to visit the two different locations to cater to what their specific needs are without having to leave the state. Having a doctor like Dr. Turen would have been a boon to any medical facility, I believe. He had quite an extensive history. Before joining Bay Health, he had worked in a few different hospitals. He worked at Shock Trauma in Baltimore, again on the other side or western side of Maryland. And Shock Trauma is one of the bigger hospitals or medical facilities where if you hear that someone is going to shock trauma, that means it is a very serious accident. He spent about 4 to 5 years at Maryland Shock Trauma as a fellow, completing a fellowship. After he completed that, he went into the Navy, and he actually served as chief of the orthopedic trauma service at Portsmouth Naval Regional Medical Center. Once he had finished his time there in the Navy, he still remained a reservist. He worked part-time for about 3 or 4 years as a consultant still with shock trauma, but then worked there as a full-time chief of orthopedics from 1993 to 2009. So altogether, he was there for more than 20 years or so, working at shock trauma, again, filling in the services of the chief of orthopedic trauma. He also served as the director of Orthopedic Traumatology Fellowship Program, And in that role, he impacted an untold number of residents that he worked with within that fellowship program. He was leading them to be able to serve others, therefore making his impact more prevalent and known in the healthcare field. Internationally, too, he served as a senior trustee of the AO Foundation and president of the AO North American membership. What the AO Foundation is a nonprofit organization of trauma surgeons that work within this nonprofit to improve the health care of those with musculoskeletal injuries or illnesses. The foundation itself has worked on developing some of the rods that you may see with someone who has an orthopedic fracture or needs orthopedic surgery, as well as developing some of the tools or instruments that can be used in those surgeries. So this foundation was geared towards those who needed the benefit of musculoskeletal services and surgeries. Now, I mentioned previously that he was part of the U.S. Navy Reserve after his time in the Navy. While he was there in the Naval Reserve, he was a commander in the Medical Corps. And when he was active, he also worked as a medical officer for the Navy SEALs. He seemed to be someone who thrived under pressure and really excelled when he was. He has quite a few more roles that he filled, and I'm just going to read directly from the next part verbatim from his obituary, so I'm not missing anything. Quote, he contributed as a dive team member and instructor, firefighter, and fire officer. He was a former special duty U.S. Marshal and led development of the tactical EMS program for the National Capital Region Anti-Terrorism Task Force. And also, with all of these accomplishments, his medical career also led him to some of the highest profile patients, including serving as a presidential medical support team member for President George H.W. Bush. Whether or not end quote. Whether he actually ever treated George H.W. Bush, it doesn't say, but he was at the level where his services would have been called upon if needed to treat that time president of the United States. He also did appear on 2 television shows, even though they were really geared towards the same thing. Both were from 2004, and one was called Critical Hour, and the other one was called Critical Hour Shock Trauma. So it really does seem like in his 55 years, he really packed a lot of activity and accomplishments in those years, really accomplishing so much that many people may just never hope to accomplish. And knowing this about him may give you a better idea of what he's able to handle and, just his persona under pressure. Does he, like I said, it seemed like he thrived under pressure. And I hate to use the term adrenaline junkie because as seeing in the medical field, you don't really want to hear that term. But in other reading, it did say that he liked extreme skiing. And so it just seems like he needs that adrenaline to keep going. Just want to make it clear, I've, of course, never met the doctor, but just reading through everything, he just seems to really have needed that pressure in order to, reach his fullest potential. He would also need to know how to approach different types of patients and their families, knowing that a lot of times they're going through one of the most traumatic experiences of their lives, whether it was a car accident or another injury that they had that could affect the rest of their lives. So he was a well-rounded man within the medical community, as well as being able to work with patients themselves. To get a little closer to the time of the incident, because you may be asking, okay, all of this is well and good, but how does he get to Bay Health? In 2009, he did leave shock trauma and moved to Georgia. He worked on developing a residency program for an orthopedic program in Georgia. And that was at the Medical Center of Central Georgia in Macon. However, in 2011, he did begin working with Bay Health in Dover. At the time of this incident, Dr. Turen was married. He had 2 sons and 2 stepdaughters and a stepson, as well as step-grandchildren. He loved baseball, and a doctor that he worked with, a Dr. Scalia, said that he used to say that the Super Bowl is what you do between World Series and spring training. So that's a quote from one of his friends. He also adding to a rivalry between Dr. Scalia and Dr. Turen. His friend does go back to New York, and Dr. Turen was a Mets fan while he himself was a Yankees fan. So, I did go to college in New York, and sometimes to hear those who were, from New York talking about the Mets and Yankees, yeah, that was a rivalry right there. So, he was very active. Like I said, he liked extreme skiing. He had even learned how to recently rope cattle, like a rodeo, when you're on horseback and you see somebody roping cattle. He had just learned to do that. So I just wanted to give this information to show him beyond his medical field that he was someone, who liked to do, other kind of pressure-filled activities in a sense, because at least to me, if I'm on horseback, my whole concentration would be on just staying on the horse, frankly. So he had that confidence in himself to take those risks and learn new things, even, close to the time of his death at the age of 55. He, though, would need to be very meticulous in all of these roles. As a skier, as someone who does this type of sports like the rodeo, he's going to want to look ahead. He has to be aware of more than just his surroundings at just that very moment. He needs to be able to look further down the ski slope or look at the surroundings, while he's on horseback to try to maintain a level of safety. So it's not just looking at the exact moment where you are. As with many things, we have to look beyond and try to anticipate what may be coming up. And the same applied in his work life, in that he would need to be very fastidious, meticulous, detail-oriented to make sure he's covering all potential outcomes and reviewing everything with the patient, with the rest of the medical staff. A friend of his, a man that he had known for more than 20 years while living in New York, said about Dr. Turen that he was, quote, a very meticulous man, and the incident that took his life was something that he could not possibly have foreseen in that dense fog. He was an unflappable man, end quote. So a friend that he'd known for quite an extensive period of time commented on whether or not he thought he could have foreseen the situation. We will, discuss the particular situation, of course, and see if maybe it was something we think he might have been able to foresee, with this quote being said before the actual NTSB report was made. So his friend is looking at it as what he knew at the time, shortly after the accident, and going into it, looking at Dr. Turen's history, saying that he didn't believe that the doctor could have foreseen what may have happened. Another person that he knew, a colleague and friend of his, was a Dr. Andrew Pollack, who is a professor and acting head of orthopedics at the University of Maryland Medical School. And again, University of Maryland Medical School is really a great hospital. So, even though here on the Eastern Shore we don't have some of the major trauma centers, we do or are able to have access to some of the others if we go to the other side of Maryland. Again, having been there myself or having other people taken to those facilities, they are very, very highly regarded and rated facilities. So Dr. Pollack said, quote, orthopedic trauma is putting bones back together, and sometimes the cases are easy and some difficult. But Cliff always knew what to do. Cliff could fix problems others had difficulty with and could teach them how to do it. It was easy for him to get along with the staff and operating room staff. He was the happiest when he was in the operating room and busy and getting a lot of things accomplished, end quote. So again, this is describing him as someone who worked well under pressure. He, as I did mention previously, he did teach as well. And he was described in his personality as being larger than life, as being jovial and extremely hardworking. I think we can see that he was extremely hardworking in all of the accomplishments that he had. Some further information or maybe observations is a good word to use, came from Dr. Scalia, and he said that Dr. Turen could see the big picture, that he had the ability to, quote, get to the essence of a problem quickly. He was dedicated, worked hard, and always did the right thing, end quote. So to me, looking at this says that he's a man who could look at a problem, again, more than just the current or right there in front of him, and look beyond that to see other factors that may affect that goal. In the case of his career, then fixing the problem, the break, the fracture, or the trauma to the best of his ability and looking ahead and knowing what issues may impact that. He would have to do a lot of things simultaneously in order to be able to accomplish that. Now, we're going to get into the accident itself. This is the smaller plane. It's, when pilots are in, say, let's use Cessna or Piper, the general aviation pilots can either be certified as either visual flight rules or instrument flight rules. So we're going to go over a few different terms that will, help us understand the accident a little better than just, going over a report with all of these terms that we may not be as familiar with. Myself, I know I had to really look up the meaning of the terms. I was somewhat familiar with them because I do watch and read a lot of aviation shows or articles. However, a lot of those have to deal with the larger aircraft. So just getting into, some of the information here with the visual flight rules, that really is what it sounds like. You're a pilot that works visually. You're not going to be flying at night. You're not going to be flying when it's going to be completely foggy and overcast, because you won't be able to know where you're going, basically. With instrument flight rules, that's when you're certified to use your instruments to detect your altitude, to know where you are, and be able to fly without necessarily having a focal point that you can look at and see. So, of course, then with instrument flight rules, the pilots have a lot more pressure on them at times. They also have more requirements that they have to meet in order to be able to be qualified as an instrument flight. In terms of equipment, you will also hear talk about the ILS system. That's an instrument landing system that is, quote, a precision radio navigation system that provides short-range guidance to aircraft to allow them to approach a runway at night or in bad weather, end quote. So it's a very detailed system where a pilot can kind of latch on to the system, for lack of a better descriptor, and that will guide them into the runway or onto the runway, so that they don't actually have to have a complete visual of lining up with the runway prior to seeing it. So you can see how this is important when flying in bad weather. There's also the WAAS, that stands for Wide Area Augmentation System. And Dr. Turen did also use a GPS system. And what the WAAS or WAS is a, quote, air navigation aid developed by the Federal Aviation Administration to augment the Global Positioning System, or GPS, with the goal of improving its accuracy, integrity, and availability. So this is, kind of an extension or add-on to the GPS. It may not necessarily be in every plane, but it was in Dr. Turen's plane. So it's something to remember when going through, what occurred on that day of the accident. Next, we have the ceiling. What the ceiling is basically the height above ground level, and that's called the AGL, where basically the clouds are at their lowest. So, just think of it really as the term implies. It's a ceiling when you look up from being, at a lower altitude. When you look up, is there a cloud, like a whole cloud system that will keep you from seeing above that? There are a couple different types of ceilings, whether it be broken or overcast. Broken means that, yes, the cloud ceiling is there, but it doesn't quite cover the whole sky. The descriptor that I found said it was usually between 5/8 to 7/8 of the sky. It's overcast when pretty much the whole sky is covered. So you may hear that throughout the episode as well. And these are just some of the more important terms that I thought it would be important to know in terms of the accident that day. Okay, now we are actually getting into the flight itself. For much of the information that I'm going to be covering, I'll be using the NTSB report itself, augmented by some other articles that were on aviation sites that help kind of break it down into, a better understanding for those of us who may not have that aviation background. We will actually discuss a few different cities or towns as the doctor is flying over the eastern shore of Delmarva. So I will try to explain just in general terms where they are, as that will have an impact on what occurs. Okay, so the flight proceeded as follows. It was a Sunday, January 13th of 2013. The estimated flight time that Dr. Turen had estimated was about 3 hours and 45 minutes. He had fueled the plane up completely, and it had about 5.5 hours worth of fuel. So just looking at that time, it looks to be almost 2 hours. So at 1 hour and 45 minutes of extra fuel. Just while this doesn't say it anywhere in any of the articles that I read, I'm thinking as well, fuel can burn at different levels depending on the situation that you're in. So if he's using, say more, more power to, say, try to fly against the wind, or he has a lot of resistance, that can burn up more fuel. So it's estimated at about 5.5 hours, but it may or may not be exactly 5.5 hours. He did file a flight plan using IFR rules. He knew that he would be needing instrument flight rules because he had checked the weather earlier that morning, and it did show that there was expected bad weather throughout the region. He filed his alternate airport as Baltimore Washington International, otherwise known as BWI. To give you an idea of where he was flying into, he expected to land in Middletown, Delaware, at Summit Airport, which was a little bit above Dover. So it's not exactly the center of Delaware, but it's pretty close. It's before you get into the northernmost county of Newcastle County. BWI is, again, on the other side, the western side of Maryland, which is, I'm going to say about 2 hours. I drive slow, so I will admit that. Some people may be able to get to and from in less than 2 hours, but for me, I'm going to say it's about a 2-hour drive. So that was a little bit of a distance as far as his alternate airport. He was beginning the flight from Sandersville, Georgia, and he needed to be in Delaware to perform surgery at 10 a.m. the following morning. He left Georgia between 1:30 and 2 p.m. Eastern Time. When he did check on the weather conditions earlier that day, he was told that at times the ceiling could be as low as 400 feet. So that's not really extremely high. However, there weren't really going to be a lot of mountains or things like that he may come across when flying, to Delaware. We're pretty flat. If you've ever been here, you definitely know that. Visibility could be as low as 2 miles. There would be rain for a lot of the trip once he made it to, more of the Eastern Shore area. And a lot of times the weather was described as a mist or misting. However, beginning at about 4 p.m., the weather was expected to start to get better. So at that time, the ceiling was thought to be able to rise to about 1,000 feet. And so he tried to make his arrival time correspond with the better weather that was expected to hit Delmarva. At this point in time, he'd had about almost 600 hours flying. So while it's not a huge amount of flying, it is still pretty substantial at that point as a private pilot, as well as him having the IFR training. Now, as he first approached Middletown Summit Airport, he was advised by the air traffic controller that the plane just prior to him had missed approaches, and so that pilot then diverted to a Wilmington airport. And again, he had to divert or didn't succeed in landing at Wilmington and had to divert to Philly. So given this information and the conditions in the area, instead of diverting to Baltimore, he began to ask some questions, asking about other airports in the area. Instead of going to Baltimore, then he decided to go to Salisbury, Maryland. That would mean he'd actually have to turn around and fly south. Middletown, like I said, is in the middle county of Delaware. It's, though, closer to the northern part of the county. So he would need to fly back through Kent and Sussex counties and land then in Salisbury. And that's about 53 miles south that he would have to go. He requested or made this diversion at about 4:49 p.m. He was told that the ceiling at Salisbury was 400 feet overcast, meaning that the cloud cover was consistent, it wasn't broken, and had a visibility of 8 miles. So by the time he turned around and headed back, he was about 15 miles south of Middletown, and it was now 4:50. Times are important on this. It was about 5:40 when he approached Salisbury. but the weather was not as good as he thought it would be. He did try to land twice using the GPS, and remember, it was augmented by the WAAS, but he missed the approach both times. I'm just going to insert my opinion here a little bit. I have to wonder if he was, after the second miss, at least starting to feel a little less confident or concerned. Even with his ability to think and stay calm under pressure, it seems as though he may have been making mistakes that someone who was as meticulous as him normally would not have made. First, Salisbury was ILS enabled. It had the instrument landing system, which was more accurate than a GPS system. Also, though, the GPS approach has a minimum descent altitude. I apologize that I missed that term a little bit earlier, but the minimum descent altitude, that's the lowest altitude at which you can descend on final approach or when you're circling into land. The minimum descent altitude at Salisbury was 306 feet above ground level. However, Dr. Turen was at 581 feet when he made the decision to terminate that attempt. With the second one, it was even more substantial. He was at 928 feet. And even though he was aligned with the runway, he then started to veer to the right and went down to 529 feet, and then at that point decided to terminate the approach there. So again, at this point, he's working with the GPS, and he said that he felt his GPS was not working correctly. But remember here, too, on these two approaches, instead of getting down lower to be more in line with what the overcast ceiling was, he decided to stop or abort the landing attempt before he even got down to the minimums. After the second attempt, instead of asking for an ILS approach, he started to ask about information on other airports. He asked if there was one that was easier, and he was told about Sussex County Airport, which is in Georgetown. That means he would start flying north again into Sussex County, Delaware. Now, I've had coworkers because there was an office we had in Buffalo, New York. So they would sometimes have to fly down to Delaware, and they would normally fly into Salisbury. But there was a time they had to divert to Georgetown, and they just kind of thought it was night and day. While Salisbury is not huge by any means, it has a lot more, I guess you'd say, modernization. It's more of a hub of activity when you compare it to Georgetown. Georgetown is, really a smaller general aviation airport. So he was leaving Salisbury, which had an ILS approach, to go to an airport that did not. And while, yes, he would have been leaving Salisbury, but he would have been flying back into weather that he had just left. So he'd been in Middletown, which was north. He flew south to Salisbury, and now he's turning around to fly north again. The weather, if not exactly the same, would have at least been very comparable because he's flown the whole distance. He would have been familiar with the weather to and from, even crossing over into Georgetown. He may not have flown directly over Georgetown, but still, it's in the same path. And the weather is not great in either of the two locations you've just been at. At this point, it's about 5:53. The ceiling was about 700 and was overcast, so that means the consistent ceiling. And 5:53 is quite a long time from when he requested the diversion from Middletown. Just to go back to that, it was about 4:50 when he started to head towards Salisbury. It was 5:40 when he approached Salisbury. And then after he decided to just stop trying to land at Salisbury, it was 5:53. So we're looking at, more than an hour from when he left Middletown. Something to also remember is it's not just, 20 seconds to try to make the approach. They would sometimes have to fly a pattern. They have to line up with the runway. So it's not just, okay, well, there's flight time, but then it only took 20 seconds or 30 seconds for him to realize he wasn't going to make the landing. So we're now an hour outside of his range from when he thought he would be landing compared to when he approached Middletown. So a full hour. The ceiling was at about 700 feet and overcast. So he headed towards Georgetown. However, as he approached, though, ATC advised him that weather had been updated, and it showed the overcast ceiling of now 300 feet. That's from 700 to 300, so that's a huge difference. But he did continue on to Georgetown, and he got there at around 6:16. He established the approach. The minimum approach was 310 above ground level for his GPS, because remember, Georgetown doesn't have GPS. And even though it was 310 feet, he did take the plane down to 250, but he missed the approach. We're now at 6:26. He is running very low on fuel. You might even say critically. He did advise ATC that he was running low and requested the same approach again. So he tried originally to, time his flight so that he would be hitting Delaware, Middletown when weather was getting better. The weather was not getting better when he thought it would be. Looking at the times again, he thought it would be about 3 hours and 45 minutes for the flight with 5.5 hours worth of fuel. But it didn't happen that way. So air traffic control, now realizing that if he did not make this next approach, he would need to go to another airport. They asked if he wanted to try an alternate airport. He asked if there was anything easier than Georgetown. The next available airport was going north again towards Middletown, though he would be aiming towards Delaware Air Park in Dover. Now, this is not Dover Air Force Base, but it uses the same weather information, and they advised of a visibility of 10 miles with a ceiling of 500 overcast. So it wasn't quite as foggy. You could have a 10-mile visibility. So he headed towards Dover, and he set up an approach to Dover Air Park. As he was getting there, he did ask ATC if there was anything or if he could land in Dover Air Force Base. ATC's response was standard, that unless it was an emergency, there's not a way that you can land at the Air Force Base. I mean, that does make sense. You don't want a lot of planes landing on Dover Air Force Base because I'm sure there's a lot that goes into that. However, there was that caveat, unless it's an emergency. No government Air Force Base is going to turn someone away who's in an emergency. I've even heard about it in bases that are in other countries that if there's an emergency, they will offer assistance. So there was that option for him. But at 6:35, he was cleared for the approach to Dover Air Park. At 6:41, though, he declared an emergency, stating that he was completely out of fuel. ATC then provided information for the ILS at Dover Air Force Base, but at this point, the plane was only about 2,000 feet mean sea level and had actually gotten past the Air Force Base. So this means he would have to turn around and go back towards DAFB. He was about 6 miles out from the Dover Air Force Base at 6:44. So this is about 3 minutes after he declared the emergency. ATC, looking at him through the radar, told him that the plane was going in the right direction, and Dr. Turen was expected to land on runway 14. But Dr. Turen's last words over his radio was that he was, quote, on tower right now, end quote. But at 6:45 and 33 seconds, his GPS noted that his airplane was at about 500 feet, 3 miles away from the Air Force Base. He no longer appeared on radar. Dover ATC contacted authorities to search for the plane. A man who lived in the area described that he heard a plane near his house. As reported in the Dover Post, Matthew Davis, who was 23 years at the time, said that the plane did in fact fly over his house. He said, quote, "The engine quit, then started, then sputtered and quit again," end quote. To put some of this in perspective, the accident took place at around 6:45. After he approached Salisbury, which is about a 1-hour drive between Salisbury and Dover, depending on traffic patterns, which route you take, how fast you go, it's still about an hour driving. So he actually spent about as much time in the air and trying to make, different approaches than it would have been if he had driven. The amount of that time is very, very important looking at this crash. Now, searchers tried to locate the plane. It took approximately 2 hours before they did so. It was found about 2 miles north of DAFB. Even though he had received the directions or vectors towards Dover, he wasn't able to make it, and he was found within the wreckage deceased. The plane itself was upside down when they found it and had hit a number of trees during the crash. When the investigators looked at the debris field, it was about 150 feet long. So really, that's not tremendously long in my opinion. I'm looking at it, again, as kind of a civilian. But when you look at a plane that theoretically should have been going faster, for it to hit something and just break apart over a series of 150 feet, to me says it was not going very fast, which, of course, if it had no fuel, it was not going to be going very fast. The debris path broke down into that at the very beginning was the right wingtip and a right flap. And then at about 100 feet, there was the actual right wing and part of the vertical stabilizer, or stabilator, I'm sorry. Then at the end of the debris field was the cockpit with Dr. Turen still inside. The main damage to the plane came from the impact to the trees. The cockpit was severely damaged by what they determined as 3 main strikes. There was a complete fuel exhaustion, really, so there was no subsequent fire once the crash occurred. A lot of times, if there's a crash and there's still fuel on board, that is one of the biggest concerns about a fire starting. When the investigators looked at the crash, there was only about a half a gallon of fuel left in the main tank. And, knowing about other plane crash incidents and even thinking about my own vehicle, if you get down to a half a gallon of fuel, you're really pushing it. And then when looking at a plane, because, it's trying to be level, but it may not always be level, the fuel tank may not be able to get to that very last part. And I'm thinking at half a gallon left, it's not going to be able to really catch on to any of the fuel in order to be able to put it into the engine. If myself, I'm just thinking of like a spray bottle that has a hose or a nozzle in it. When you get down to that bottom part, unless you tilt it so that the end of the nozzle tube is within the liquid, you're not going to be getting the rest of it out. And if it's a nozzle that doesn't bend and goes straight down, it's not going to be able to pick up enough of the fluid to bring it up. That's kind of, to me, the first thing that I think of, is how sometimes you have to kind of fight to get to that last bit of liquid at the end of the nozzle. And even though this is on a much larger scale, it's still kind of the same principle. So there were a lot of working parts to this flight. And while about the first 3 hours and 20 minutes or so was uneventful, the last leg took much longer than it should have. The NTSB does approach investigations looking at more than just one thing, of course. So one of the first things they want to look at is the pilot himself. They look at aspects of a personal life, which may look at whether they may have been fatigued. Was there any stress that they may have been going through at that time that they normally wouldn't be? But the main part is looking at the qualifications of the pilot. Now, as I said, he did have the certificates for a single-engine plane, but he did have his instrument rating as well. He had those instrument ratings for about 2.5 years prior to the accident, so it's not something that was too new to him. He also had his medical exam for his pilot's license and had passed that about 1.5 years prior to the incident. So, just to show as far as general aviation, they don't just say, take a look at you when you first get your license and then say that's it. Almost like they do with our driver's license. They really just check your eyesight for the most part. With pilot's license, they do these checks and you have to have that examination to make sure there aren't any health issues that may contribute to an accident. He had almost 600 hours of flying time. It was 598. He had 77 hours using instrument flying. They also look at the time period immediately prior to the accident. They want to make sure that, say, someone's not rusty. If you go back to doing something that you haven't done in a long time, it takes you a little while to kind of catch up or catch on again. So he had flown 15 hours in the previous 30 days. So he had been flying recently. It wasn't though it had been months. They then look at the plane. Now, this plane was older, being manufactured in 1970, but planes do tend to last quite a long time. I've even come across planes that were, built in the 1950s or earlier that are still being used. And there are pilots who actually restore the older planes and sometimes race them or take them to shows. So, planes that are very, very old, even decades old, are still around and in flyable condition. This is even seen with the larger airliners. The plane itself had been inspected only about 1.5 years prior to the crash. So again, pretty recently that it had been inspected. The plane itself had over 5,600 flying hours, but the engine itself had 950 hours. So that had been replaced and overhauled. It also had the GPS system added with the WAAS. Along with this, he had a handheld GPS system. The next and probably biggest factor that we will see in this case was weather. That pretty much led the whole flight after he made it to Delmarva. He had checked the weather prior to taking off, but he did check it at just around 10 a.m., so it was not immediately before he took off. He did get weather information, though, from more than one airport. So while he was expecting to fly into Middletown Summit Airport. In an indirect way, he received information about the Wilmington Airport because he knew that another pilot had not been able to land there. So even though he didn't have specific information, he knew that it probably wasn't great either if a pilot was not able to land there. The weather information that he received, though, said that at 4 o'clock, it was supposed to be getting better, but it didn't. Since we went through a lot of the weather information individually while he was, asking for information and diverting, I'm not going to repeat all of it again, other than to say that it was not what he had expected. Now, once all of the pieces of the puzzle were assembled, and realizing that, yes, there were varying degrees of bad weather throughout any of the approaches that he made, the NTSB indicated that the main reason that this accident occurred was because he did not fly, quote, the 2 GPS approaches to the published descent altitude at the first diversion airport. His failure to attempt an instrument landing system approach at that airport, and his delay in declaring an emergency, which resulted in fuel exhaustion and low instrument meteorological conditions. End quote. So just let's look at these times again all together instead of, more fragmented as we did as the flight was actually occurring. He's near the Middletown Summit Airport when he decides to head towards Salisbury. That's at 4:50 in the afternoon. The plane crashed at 6:45. That's almost 2 hours that he spent diverting to different airports without being able to land. So between the hours of 4:50 and 6:45, he went from Middletown to Salisbury. That's going through 2 almost complete counties. And by the time he sets up the alignment through the GPS to try to land, it's not, again, just flying time. There is a setup time to approach the landing, and he did that twice. He then, after flying about 53 miles south, then heads north again to Georgetown, which is 20-some miles. I would say about 20 to 25 miles. And again, he sets up a landing using precious time and fuel that he didn't have. After that, he has to head back again towards Dover. He asks about landing at Dover Air Force Base, and ATC correctly responds that he cannot land there unless it's an emergency. So instead of declaring an emergency, he flies past DAFB and is heading towards Dover Air Park. I'm sorry, I do keep trying to say airport, but it's Air Park. However, he realizes that he is in an emergency and asks to be able to land at Dover by declaring an emergency. But at that point, it's too late and fuel has been exhausted. So what happened to make a man who is so meticulous, who is someone who thrives under pressure, make these types of mistakes, period? Some might say that he didn't have a good understanding of the weather conditions for the whole area. And I'll have to agree to that. It may have been also an understanding of exactly where each airport was along the weather path, but no matter where he was, whether it was northern while approaching Middletown or to the south, he didn't seem to know that the weather conditions were approximately the same as far as, visibility, the ceiling, as well as there were changes to the forecast, even in just a few moments from flying from one airport to another. There were significant changes that happened. Having an understanding of where he was and where he was going may have given him a better idea that the weather was not good along any of the flight path. If he realized, he just flew from the south to north, what was the weather like south again since he was going to be flying back south? Why didn't he declare an emergency earlier on? Even though he expected to have about 5.5 hours worth of fuel, he was quickly approaching that time, realizing that he needed time to set up an approach, that it wouldn't just be, again, to repeat, not a quick line up and try to land. It does take time to fly an approach pattern. So why didn't he declare an emergency earlier, allowing him to fly into Dover from the south into Dover as compared to flying past DAFB and then turning around once he realized he wasn't going to make Dover Airport and have to fly back to Dover Air Force Base? I think we can find the answer to that in one of the memories, or I guess you would say reflections, of a friend and colleague of his. In one of the memorials or articles written about him, I'm going to quote for about a paragraph, a medium-sized paragraph, of what a doctor observed through his friendship and time working with Dr. Turen. Quote, "Of all his accomplishments in orthopedics, Dr. Turen was most proud of his involvement in the training of so many surgeons currently in practice. On a personal note, Dr. Turen was old-fashioned in many regards. He had high standards for himself and expected those around him to live up to those standards. For example, he wore a tie and jacket to work each day and was known to sentence the unfortunate resident caught outside the hospital in scrubs to 2 weeks in clinic. He valued honor, respect, friendship, loyalty, and surgical excellence, and held those with similar values in the highest esteem. He was always available if you needed something. There was never, 'Let me check my schedule,' or 'I'm not sure, but let me get back to you.' It was, 'When do you need me?' For those of us who knew him well, when you ran into trouble at work, or more importantly in life in general, and were not sure who to call, the answer was always, 'Call Cliff.'" End quote. So Dr. Clifford Turen was a man who had a very high bar. He put a lot of pressure on himself, in my opinion, and not only himself, but those around him. When in a situation that would have shown that possibly he didn't have a good understanding of what was going on around him, or that he may have made questionable decisions earlier, I think, and again, just to say this is my opinion, I think that he was afraid to admit that he needed some assistance himself. He needed the assistance of having to land at an Air Force base when he himself had served in the military, had served at very high, responsibility and positions, and he did not want to have to admit that. When it got to the very end, though, he was in a position where it was too little, too late. He realized he had to finally make that call to say it was an emergency, and by the time he did so, he wasn't able to make it back to that one safe haven that he had just bypassed not too much earlier. Looking at Dr. Turen's stellar career and achievements, it seems very sad to leave some of his legacy with this note, with the fact that maybe he didn't reach out for help when he needed it, that he may not have wanted to admit to mistakes that he had made. Let's take a look at some of the memory or legacy that he left behind. And yet another reflection on Dr. Turen's life coming from Penn Orthopedics. I will read directly from that. Quote, "With Dr. Turen's passing, we have lost a truly passionate educator, a dedicated and hard-working orthopedic surgeon, and a great friend. His impact and his legacy live on through the countless orthopedic trauma fellows and residents he has touched over the years with his commitment to the care of the injured. Dr. Turen will be greatly missed by all at Penn Orthopedics, and our thoughts are forever with his family." End quote. And to continue his legacy of being an educator, there was also a fellowship made in his honor. To quote information about the fellowship, "In memory of Clifford H. Turen, M.D., an extraordinary surgeon, educator, and leader who made countless contributions to the field of orthopedic trauma surgery, the University of Maryland has established a Fellowship Endowment Fund. The Clifford H. Turen, M.D. Fellowship Endowment Fund will honor the very best young trainees and renowned scholars in the field of orthopedic trauma surgery, providing support in two areas of utmost importance to orthopedic trauma professionals. Fellowships offer essential support to junior-level faculty as they establish research careers, gain teaching experience, and provide patient care. This fund benefits top trainees in the field of orthopedic trauma surgery in a multitude of ways, supplementing salary, purchasing equipment, and paying for research expenses or professional travel. It is especially critical in today's challenging economic environment, as few young faculty members qualify for salary and resource support from state and federal sources. The Clifford H. Turen, M.D. Fellowship Endowment Fund will additionally support an annual lectureship in the field of orthopedic trauma surgery by covering travel and expenses for world-renowned scholars to visit the University of Maryland. Lectureships are essential to the intellectual enrichment of the university and the scientific community at large because they provide the opportunity for scholars from other institutions to share their ideas and research findings at lectures and seminars. In turn, these guests learn from our faculty members whom they meet during the visit." End quote. So through this endowment, Dr. Turen's legacy will live on, so that while he died in this tragic accident, and while the investigation did put a lot of the accident factors onto the pilot, he was still a great man who contributed so much to the world of medicine. And to this day, his influence lives on in those that he taught, in the tools that he helped develop, and all aspects of medicine that his career touched. He also lives on with the patients that he helped heal and live a better quality of life by the surgeries that he performed. Thank you guys so much for sticking in to the end. I know it's a long episode, but I did want to discuss more about what he did since we had that information. If you are interested in aviation, like I said, I will have another episode about an aviation incident with a smaller craft on the Mystifyingly Missing podcast. It should be uploaded within 24 hours of this one being uploaded, in case you want to take a listen to that. Hopefully it'll be less than 24 hours, but that was an interesting case as well. But it also shows the humanity of the doctor as well, that in the accident on the Mystifyingly Missing podcast, he was going home from a family event from celebrating his father's 99th birthday. So it puts it on that human level as well, knowing, he had just spent time with all of his family. So that was about the other podcast will be about Dr. Richard Rockefeller, if you did want to tune into that a little bit later today or tomorrow, once I get it uploaded. I hope everybody has a great week upcoming, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.